and that God really reigns in the heavens. Or you hear the psalmist in Psalm 11 and verse 4, the Lord is in his holy temple, the Lord's throne is in heaven. I mean, they clearly understood that what God wasn't contained to a building, okay? And yet there is some significant things about these different places. God did reveal that his presence was connected to certain places, if you would, right? And so, you know, there's these mountains that we're on right now. The mountains are calling, and some of these mountains are places of God's divine presence. Or maybe we should say were places of God's divine presence. And that really takes us into a biblical theme of the sacred mountain, right? The sacred mountain. And we've kind of hit on that a little bit as we've gone through this series, but I'm gonna dwell there a little more once we got to Zion here. Remember when we started this series out, I think our second lesson was about Eden, the original mountain of divine presence. And see, I know how to spell divine right there. So it's just making sure you know that. You know? But you know, there's God in the garden, and we understood and we found out, right, that the Eden was kind of a raised biblical, you know, the Hebrew word for mountain is hor, H-O-R. If you transliterated it into English, it can mean raised place, hill, mountain. And we're just kind of going with mountain, but mostly here in this series. And one of the ways we know that is from Genesis 2 and verse 10, that you have these river flowing out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. You know, we're kind of familiar that water flows downhill, right? So Eden is a raised place. And, you know, if you want to dispute that, we also have Ezekiel chapter 28 and verses 13 and 14. You know, you were in Eden, the garden of God. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God, right? And so Eden, the mountain of God. And we know from Genesis 3 that God would walk with Adam and Eve in the garden. So there's this place of God's presence on this mountain. And so you have this image of Eden as this place of wonderful place that we really want to get back to, don't we? And this place of that makes it even the best place. It's a place of divine fellowship. God walking with his creation. And yet we know the story that sin enters in and humanity gets expelled from the garden. And so no more access to the garden of God in Eden. But that doesn't end the story of God's divine presence. You move through your Bible, your Hebrew Bible, and you get to Exodus, and all of a sudden you keep finding this idea that Sinai is the mountain of God. Right? And so in Exodus 3 and verse 1, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb. Horeb, you're what? You're the mountain of God. You see that in Exodus 4:27. And the Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went and met him at the mountain of God. And you see it in Exodus 18. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness where he was encamped at the mountain of God. In Exodus 24 and verse 13, Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. And so clearly by the time we get to Exodus now, Sinai's got that designation of it's the mountain of God. Eden was the original one. Now Sinai is the mountain of God when you get to Exodus. And you might refer to Sinai as the holy, everybody look at the wording, awful mountain, right? I know you're all groaning at my pun. That's better than me misspelling divine, though. Just letting you know, okay? and you have that there as Israel is encamped at Sinai. And so you have texts like Exodus chapter 19. You shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. Right? Here's this mountain of God, and it's like not everybody gets there. Exodus 19:18. Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. In Exodus 24 and verse 17, the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain. And so you have this, we can get more. We can go, or we can grab more out of Exodus. We can grab more out of Deuteronomy. But we've got the picture, don't we? When Israel's encamped at Sinai, Sinai looks like a volcano. And Moses goes up. And there God enters covenant, with Israel. And then some things change a little bit, don't they? Because once God enters covenant with Israel, one of their duties, one of their things that they are told to do is to make God a tent so he can go camping. Right? So he will move with his people. And so the tabernacle is built as God's kind of movable house, with the Ark of the Covenant representing God's throne presence among his people. And so here's kind of this movement. We've had the divine presence at Eden. We've had the divine presence kind of at Sinai. I mean, obviously at times we've had God enter, coming into human history and dealing with Abraham and his family, right? And Noah, and we got a lot of instances of, but those are kind of two places that kind of get this designation of, hey, this is where God is. It's God's home. Eden, Sinai. But now God moves. He moves with the tabernacle. He moves with the Ark of the Covenant. And so he says, I'm going to meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the Ark of the Testimony, I'll speak with you. So God's going to go when the Ark of the Covenant goes. Or you hear in Numbers chapter 7, when Moses went to the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from above the mercy seat that's on the Ark of the Testimony. And then, that ark moves around with the tabernacle as Israel moves around. And then finally, to make a long story short, because I'm going to be long enough anyway, the people went to Shiloh and brought from there the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of hosts, who's enthroned on the cherubim, right? And so you have this movement of God being enthroned on the cherubim, and you've got this movement of the throne of God from Sinai to dwell with his people and in the tabernacle, and God goes with them. And you have that, it's not only just the Ark of the Covenant, it's that cloud and that pillar of fire that you can read about in Exodus chapter 40. You see it also kind of in Numbers chapter 10 and verses 33 and 34. And that ark goes from place to place until finally David brings it to Jerusalem. Right? David brings it to Jerusalem. The ark of the Lord, he got it and he brought it and he set it in its place. And so now the divine presence is going to have more of a stationary place, if you would. Remember all the time that God's not contained to the Ark of the Covenant, right? We set that, got that set for you before we ever started any of this. So don't think that we're going down that, boy, he's just contained right there. but there is an element of his presence being represented there, is there not? It's different than other places. Okay. And if Sinai was this kind of threatening, not everybody can come up, awful place, Sinai in turn is kind of more of this welcoming mountain of divine presence. And the idea of Zion kind of changes, and its significance really develops over time. It kind of begins as this, Jebusite fortress that David's going to capture when we first, kind of come across the idea of Zion. We know from Psalm 51, Zion can also take on the meaning of the city of Jerusalem. And we also know from Isaiah 51 and verse 16 that Zion can also represent just the covenant people, right? Saying to Zion, you are my people. So, like most biblical things, you have to kind of, you can't just say Zion and just slap one definition down on it. There's various meanings to what Zion has. And that's back to being good Bible students, and so you know what the meaning of the word is by the context in which it is used. Okay? But after the completion of the temple and the installation of the ark, you can read about in 1 Kings chapter 6 through 8. In some ways, you could say that Jerusalem became more than a city. It became the place of God's dwelling. It became Zion. In fact, the mountain of Zion, right, that little phrase refers to the Temple Mount itself, where God dwells. And so not only can you have those, this is the old Jebusite fortress or the people or the city of Jerusalem, Zion can specifically refer to the mountain of God's temple, the place where God's throne, right, the Ark of the Covenant, resided in God's house, the temple. And so you have some psalms like this: sing praises the Lord who sits enthroned in Zion. Well, where's his throne at? It's the Ark of the Covenant. Where's the Ark of the Covenant at? It's in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. That's Zion. Or you have Psalm 26 and verse 8, "O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells." Or Psalm 76 and verse 2, "His abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion." In Psalm 132 and verse 13, "The Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place." So these set of texts just say, well, the Temple Mount, where God's temple is, right? The house of God is, that's God's dwelling place. And so Zion can refer specifically to that. And when you have it meaning that Zion was this place where heaven and earth met. The designated place for God to encounter his people. Because God's house, the temple, was at Zion. God's throne, the Ark of the Covenant, was at Zion. God's instruction, the Torah inside the ark for living with him was at Zion. And so here the people in covenant with him, once you have that temple built, Zion's this kind of special place. And that's why in the Psalms, you have the songs of Zion. Right? There's several psalms that are singing about Zion. In fact, they get referenced this way once they are in exile and the Jews are looking back on, what they used to have. Their tormentors would talk to them in Psalm 137 and say, "Oh, that Zion, that's so great. Don't you have some pretty music about it? Why don't you sing to us some of those songs of Zion?" And just kind of grinding it into the Jewish people that they're in exile. But on the flip side, that tells us what? They had songs of Zion. And they would sing those songs not before their tormentors or their captors, right? But they try to sing those songs to keep their hope alive. And so one move here this morning, and I'm not sure it's all going to work together, so we'll say it's just the way the week went, right? One move is I'm introducing you to the sacred mountain motif that we have started with Eden, and we've moved to Sinai, and then we moved to Zion. And now, since we're talking about songs of Zion, I want to stop and just look at one of those. And that's Psalm 99 that we had read for us this morning. Here, this is a psalm about encountering God at Zion. And it starts with this exaltation of God. The Lord reigns, let the people tremble. And so it starts off with this personal name of God. You see how the ESV went with all caps for Lord. That tells us underneath it's Yahweh. It's this personal name for God, right? His personal, and in fact, that occurs 7 times in this psalm. This is saying we're coming to Zion to have this relationship with God. He's not just the king. He is king, but he's not just the king. He's Yahweh. So let the people tremble. Right? He's reigning there. He's enthroned there. And the response to being in the presence of the exalted God, according to this text, is to tremble. And that's the natural reaction of a soul in the presence of an altogether holy God. You say, are you sure about that, Mark? I'm glad you asked me. That's a question I can answer. Because when that happens to Isaiah, what's he say in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 5? When the holiness of God is revealed to him, he says, whoa. Whoa. I'm a person of unclean lips. He's recognizing that he is in the presence of something altogether different than what you normally experience in this world. He's encountering the holy God. And so that's more than just simply respect or reverence. It includes an element, if you would, of holy fright at the Lord's grandeur. And notice in this psalm that the Lord is not just King of Israel. Let me get back to that one. But he is also King over all, right? The Lord is great in Zion, but he's also to be exalted over all the people. Now, I don't know about you. Maybe you've got it all figured out. I know some people think they've got it all figured out. And I view them with suspicion. I don't fully understand how God's dominion totally works. How about you? I do know that God is in charge, and I deliberately eschew the term control there, but he's in charge, and that he allows humans to freely choose to do good or evil, because he doesn't control us to do certain things. And yet somehow in the midst of that, which makes him even greater in my mind, is he still is working his plan. I do know that God is currently at work. How about you? And I also know that not everything or everyone does what God wants and desires. But whether I understand everything or not about the reign of God, I'll tell you this. I am convinced that God is reigning currently. And I am convinced that he has set everything, he will set everything right
in its time. Every entity, both corporate and individual, is subject to the reigning King God. And every entity, both corporate and individual, is accountable to God. And he will set things right in its time. And so there is a great desire, it should be, among the people of God to exalt our King who is reigning. And that's what this Zion Psalm starts with. Let's exalt our God. And so in verse 3, there's this address to God. Let them praise your great and awesome name. So this is this exhortation to worship God properly. And that's not just for Israel, but it's for all the peoples, the nations. The nations should worship this God who is holy. And then you have this refrain that marks out the different sections of this psalm of holy is he. God is absolutely distinctive, different from everything else. Holy is he. And so there's this first set of things in this psalm about exalting God, right? That we've got this great God that needs to be exalted. And then the next section in verses 4 and 5 are about God's justice. Our mighty King loves justice. Isn't that what the text says? And, we didn't need this psalm to tell us that. We've got it throughout Scripture. I'm just going to dip into a couple of places, Deuteronomy and Psalms. And I mean, it's a quick dip this morning, folks. We could be here an awful long time. But here in Deuteronomy chapter verse 17 and 18, the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God who's not partial. Here's his justice, right? Who's not partial, takes no bribe. We need more people like that in Washington, D.C. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widows, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Boy, just track that down about how God is always on the side of like the widows and the orphans. And, that just occurs throughout our biblical text. Or Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 4, the rock, his work is perfect, for all of his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness, without iniquity, just and upright is he. Or another psalm, and we're in Psalm 99, so I'll give you another one here. Psalm 9, the Lord sits enthroned forever. He's established his throne for justice. He judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And so when we encounter this idea of God's justice in Psalm 99, it's not a new thing. This is something revealed, that God revealed about himself throughout Scripture. And then in Psalm 99 and verse 4, you have another address to the Lord. You've established equity. You've executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. In other words, what's he saying? God, you've established it. You are the source of what is right. You are the source of what is just. Righteousness is what is in harmony with the character of God, because God is unconditionally upright in his essence and actions. And then the response from the congregation to that is supposed to be, we are to exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool, and then we get the refrain again, holy is he. And this holiness then tells us that involves justice and righteousness, right? Holy is he, he's distinct from everything else. Holy is he because what? practices justice and righteousness. And then the third section of Psalm 99 is about God's forgiveness. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, Samuel among those who called upon his name. They called to the Lord and he answered them. In the pillar of the cloud, he spoke to them, and they kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. And so here you have this Moses and Aaron, Samuel among his priests. Why are they all classified like that? Because what's the function of the priest? To bring God to people and to bring people to God. Isn't that what Moses did? Right? Isn't that what he did? You know, you call on the Lord on behalf of God's people, and you teach people the way of the Lord. And that's why the kept his testimonies is in there, because if you're going to be the faithful priest, you're going to have to keep his testimonies as you teach other people about, you know, God's testimonies. These men were faithful, obedient, right? And so they would pass on and live by God's revealed will, his word, his law, his commandments, his instruction. You know, they didn't think of it simply as suggestions or guidelines or something that God didn't really mean. Oh, he said it, but he was just trying to fill up space in the book. No. God wanted it down for people to know. And then you have a response again addressed to God. Oh, Lord, our God, you answered them. You were forgiving God to them, but an avenger of their wrongdoings. You might say, since this text says, you know, God answered them, you know, God's just a call away. Isn't he? God's just a call away. And he's the God who answers them and he shows forgiveness. So you don't need to despair, but also don't presume upon his grace, because he's a avenger of wrongdoing. And the congregation is again supposed to come back and respond with the exaltation of the Lord our God. We've got gratitude for the forgiveness that should lead us to worshiping our God. And this text says, you know, worship him at his holy mountain. So that's why I selected this one out to talk about the songs of Zion, because that's a reference to Zion here. Right? By the time this psalm was written, you've got, you know, Zion is the temple. And so this is about worship at his holy mountain, worship at Zion. And it's holy, his holy mountain, because why? God is there. God is there. And then you have this refrain again at the end, for the Lord our God is holy. And that acts as this closing proclamation about the character of God, that he's set apart from everything else. And the person who praises God for his mercy and forgiveness does not ignore or make light of his call for holiness. We kind of stepped into that some Wednesday night in 1 Peter. We're going to be in it some more this next Wednesday night. And for me, that's one of the most important things we can talk about biblically, is the holiness of God and his call for his people to be holy. And that vocabulary has somewhat been lost by us. And when we understand that holiness is with our God, that also tells us that although there's forgiveness, that doesn't mean that there can't also be consequences. Right? And sometimes I think what's gone on in our country is as our culture, you know, has moved increasingly away from the holiness and the righteousness of God. And we could debate that if you want to, but is it really debatable? Right? I think sometimes we've been content, now hear me here, to say, oh, if I just stay an arm's length away from culture, I'm good. And you know, because look, I'm not as bad as where culture is going. You tracking with me here? I mean, I'm not just doing an airy-fairy Zion psalm for you. I want to make this practical. But the problem with that is what? Culture keeps moving. And I'd move farther, but the microphone wouldn't start picking me up, and we want to stay online for everybody, right? So, you know, but if you just try to just stay, if that's your standard of just staying an arm's length away from culture, the more culture moves, guess what? The more you're moving. And the problem there is you've made the standard the wrong thing. The standard is, I'm better than culture. That's the wrong standard for the people of God. The standard is our holy God. That's where it is. And so we've got to stay with our holy God and not just think, oh, we're doing good because we're not as bad as culture is. All right? Because relationship with God, all ready to write this one down? Gotta be. It's not about sin management. It's about sin elimination. You just stay moving with culture, you're just trying to manage sin. But be holy as I'm holy calls us for sin elimination, folks. That's what it does. This psalm says we've got a holy God and we need to exalt him. Now, the reason we went over there was not only to give us something very practical and tangible to take home with us, but it's an example of a Zion psalm. And that's what we're talking about this morning is Zion, the mountain of God's presence. Because I can spell God's. Okay. Okay. So let me move you back to the idea of Zion then for just a minute. Because I think I would be doing you a disservice if I left us this morning with a physical place in the Middle East as the place of the divine presence. I'd be doing us a disservice, and that's where I've taken you so far. So let's move the concept of Zion forward, right? I won't take too long with this, but we can move it forward because we have Zion in the prophets, and when we turn to say the prophet Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 11, God vacates his house. In fact, he puts it up for destruction. Right? It's not just for sale anymore. It's for destruction. The glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city. And so now, since God vacates Zion, physical Zion is not the place of God's presence. Okay? It stopped, if you would, being the home of God. Tracking with me here? Okay. And so because of that, the prophets envisioned a time of a restored Zion. And I think that's especially where we get into the spiritual meaning, if you would, instead of just a physical piece of property, the spiritual meaning of Zion. Because Zion in the prophets becomes a rich theological image to depict the reign of God. And it becomes a symbol, if you would, of new creation, what we're all looking for. It becomes a symbol of redeemed humanity that lives before God without sin and death and pain because God is ruling in the midst of us. And so you have a sample text, and this is just one sample text. in Isaiah chapter 2. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. And you can go back and read some of the Zion Psalms about, how exalted Zion is over all the mountains. You realize that in the Jerusalem area, Zion isn't the highest mountain there. Mount of Olives is taller. Because you could go up Mount of Olives and look down on the temple. So you say, that tells us we're into a figurative idea here. Okay. Established as the highest of the mountains and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And so there's this idea, and again, there's plenty of other texts. We touched on some of them when we went through Isaiah together. Isaiah's got a rich theology of Zion. There's this idea of Zion that's in the future for them. And by the time we turn into our New Testament, notice something that happens here. And I'm not going to spend much time here because the last lesson in this series is I want to close out with Zion but let me just say it this way for us, so I leave us in the right place this morning. Zion refers to the people of God constructed upon Christ. Zion's cornerstone. And so Peter quotes from the Hebrew scriptures, and behold, I'm laying in Zion a stone. See, where is it? It's in Zion. And I'm laying this stone, this cornerstone, chosen, precious, and whoever believes in him. Clearly in 1 Peter 2, this is the Christ, isn't it? This is Jesus. Will not be put to shame. And so from this text in 1 Peter 2, Zion now has this cornerstone, and people who build themselves upon this cornerstone. We're in Zion. We're in Zion. And then that also goes into the rich, New Testament image of the temple of God that I'm not going to this morning. I may later, but not this morning, okay? Or you pick it up in Hebrews chapter 12. You've come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly. Hear this? This isn't a piece of dirt. This isn't on, Rand McNally's map of the Middle East. The heavenly Jerusalem. To the innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all. Does that start to sound like some of these psalms we've been saying and some of this other stuff about Zion? And to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Let me give you one more, and we'll call it good for the morning. But I hope we leave here with an appreciation of the idea of Zion as God's sacred mountain. Because as we get to the end of our New Testament, it's Zion's the place where God reigns in and through Christ, as well as the people under his authority forever. Because you have this vision then in Revelation 14. I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb. I don't want to take Mount Zion any more literally than I want to take the lamb. How about you? Okay. And with him, the 144,000. Now, can I add to that? I don't want to take Zion any more literally than I take the lamb literally, any more than I take the 144,000 literally. Rich symbolic meanings that if we've read our scriptures, just resonate with us. You know, and who are these people? They had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. This is the people of God that have built their lives on the cornerstone of Christ. So let me ask this morning, have you come to Zion? Have you come to Zion? And are you building your life on Christ, the cornerstone? If you haven't come to Zion, you're really missing out, because that's the place of God's presence. Why would we want to live in God's world without God's presence? Well, there's a lot of people that do, but it makes no sense to me. And if you start saying, I want the presence of God, you got to come to Zion. You got to come to the precious cornerstone. You got to come to Christ, so you can be cleansed by his blood that speaks better than the blood of Abel. So let me say it the way I said it there. It's not only have we come to Zion, you know, are we building? Not just that we start